Mesdames et messieurs, bonsoir. Bienvenue à la bien nommée Maison de la Paix. Je ne suis évidemment pas Philippe Burin, qui n'est malheureusement pas là avec nous ce soir, pris par d'autres engagements. Je suis Vincent Chetaille, professeur de droit international à l'Institut et directeur du Centre des migrations globales. Je vous remercie d'être venus si nombreux aujourd'hui pour cet événement organisé en étroite collaboration avec le CICR. C'est du reste le deuxième événement que nous organisons ensemble dans le cadre de l'accord de collaboration conclu entre l'Institut et le CICR l'année dernière. Et la thématique de cet événement est dédiée à la perspective humanitaire de la migration et du déplacement. Je me bornerai ici à deux remarques liminaires pour contextualiser les termes du débat sur assistance humanitaire, migration et déplacement. Il y a, à mon avis, deux précisions importantes à faire. La première, il convient de distinguer deux réalités qui sont rejointes par l'assistance humanitaire, mais somme toute dissociées. La migration, caractérisée par le franchissement d'une frontière internationale, et le déplacement qui reste généralement entendu comme un déplacement à l'intérieur des frontières d'un État. Les besoins humanitaires et les réponses apportées par l'État et la communauté internationale doivent évidemment tenir compte de cette réalité différente entre la migration et le déplacement, même si évidemment le besoin humanitaire est identique dans les deux cas. Le point commun qui unit la migration et le développement est finalement, outre la question humanitaire, le point commun est le poids considérable que doivent supporter les pays du Sud, tant dans le domaine de la migration forcée que dans les déplacements internes. Pour l'illustrer, je me bornerai à quelques chiffres, très peu, mais un seul parle de lui-même. Près de 90% du nombre total de réfugiés dans le monde sont accueillis dans les pays du Sud. On est donc loin de l'image de migrants venant envahir le Nord, car la plupart d'entre eux sont accueillis dans des pays en voie de développement, ce qui amène à un constat élémentaire. L'assistance humanitaire doit travailler de concorde avec le développement, précisément pour faire face aussi aux besoins des pays les plus concernés. Et pour ceux qui le sont moins, c'est-à-dire les pays du Nord, ils ont une responsabilité toute particulière à assurer et donc financer cette assistance humanitaire qui bénéficie aussi bien aux migrants qu'aux déplacés internes. La seconde et dernière remarque porte sur le nombre des déplacés et des réfugiés, car on entend beaucoup de chiffres. Les médias ne sont pas toujours aussi les meilleurs reflets de la réalité. Et simplement, là encore, un seul chiffre. Selon les statistiques du HCR, il y a environ 65 millions de déplacés forcés dans le monde. Mais en réalité, sur ces 65 millions, il y a plus de 32 millions qui sont des personnes déplacées internes. Et c'est-à-dire que 22 millions sont des réfugiés, des migrants forcés. Alors c'est déjà trop, mais parmi le déplacement forcé, la migration forcée, ce sont surtout des déplacements internes. Et là encore, l'assistance humanitaire est importante. Mais je croyais important de le rappeler pour aussi relativiser l'image qu'on ne voit de partout de cette pression migratoire qui n'aurait de cesse de venir aux frontières de l'Europe, ce qui ne correspond à pas grand-chose, en tout cas selon ce qui est établi dans les faits ou la recherche. Il suffirait de se rappeler qu'au pic de la fameuse crise des réfugiés en Europe, qui a vu arriver 1,2 million de demandeurs d'asile. Ce 1,2 million de demandeurs d'asile correspond grosso modo à 0,2% de la population de l'Union européenne, sachant qu'à la même période, le Liban en acceptait plus et la Turquie en acceptait 3 fois plus. On a donc là des moyens de relativiser cela. L'assistance humanitaire nous permet de nous centrer sur l'essentiel, c'est-à-dire un besoin de protection immédiat dans les pays en crise lorsque le déplacement interne est visé et dans les pays de transit qui accueillent la majorité des réfugiés dans le monde, essentiellement dans les pays du Sud, qui sont face à un double défi, le défi de l'assistance humanitaire immédiate pour pallier aux besoins des personnes déplacées et le défi inhérent à ces États, qui est un défi évidemment du développement. Je passe maintenant la parole à ma collègue Melanie Kolbe, qui sera la modératrice de cet événement. Mélanie est professeure assistante en relations internationales à l'Institut et travaille également sur la question des migrations. Et je demanderai également à nos deux éminents panélistes de monter sur scène. Merci.
So thank you very much for attending today's event. And I would like to first open a little bit more about the topic and the topic of discussion for today and introduce our panelists some more. And as you may have seen, over the past few years, we have actually witnessed an increasing number of cases of forced migration. May it be due to civil war as in Syria, or a state collapse as in Afghanistan, or even ethnic cleansing as it is in the case in Myanmar. So of course these cases are not exhaustive of the unsettling number of forced displacement processes we are witnessing at the moment, but they do highlight that tens of millions of vulnerable individuals are actually forced to relocate in order to survive. And in this process, they do require humanitarian aid and protection. So in today's discussion, we would like actually to address how we can better protect and assist those individuals, those that have crossed borders, but also those that have fled to other areas within their home country. And we will actually do so specifically with a humanitarian focus, humanitarian perspective, while also giving a voice to those that have gone or are going through the process of displacement. So to do so, we are actually pleased to welcome Mr. Peter Maurer, who's the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Mr. Ahmad Al-Rashid, who has personally experienced forced displacement, forced migration, and has also worked with many other individuals affected by this. So in the next hour, I would actually like to have an interactive discussion about the challenges and experiences of forced migration, as well also the prospects for humanitarian aid and protection. And as a professor of political science and international relations with an expertise in migration, this is of particular interest to me, and I will have the great pleasure to moderate this discussion. At the moment, we will just stay with our discussion at the podium here, but at a later point, we would also like to ask to have our audience involved and give a couple of Q&A questions. So my first question actually goes to Ahmed. So someone who has personally and professionally experience with displacement within and across borders, what is your view on the challenges of displacement for those that are directly affected, but also those that would like to help? And in doing so, could you also tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be here. My name is Ahmad Al-Rashid. I am originally from Aleppo, Syria. I was born and bred in Aleppo up to the point of 2012. When I had to make the hard decision of moving out of eastern Aleppo to northern Iraq. And again, just going to give you a little bit, background about my experience with displacement. So, I was internally displaced within Syria for some time. And then also I had to move to northern Iraq, to the Kurdistan region of Iraq, where I was an asylum seeker there, working with Syrian refugees there, and later on with Iraqi displaced people after the fall of Mosul to the Islamic State. And after the security situation deteriorated there, I had to flee Iraq as well back to Syria, then to Turkey, then make the whole journey, the 55-day journey from the Middle East to the UK, crossing borders, seas, rivers, by land, sea, and air. Eventually, arrived in the UK as an asylum seeker. Then I got my refugee status, and now I'm living in the UK, and now in the process of being integrated into the UK society. So it starts from leaving your door in Syria, reaching your door or your new home in the UK, and I've lived through the whole experience. To answer your question about the challenges, the people who are actually experiencing displacement, and people who are trying to help these people, or trying the host community or the humanitarians. I think that we need to, from the outset, to state that when we are talking about displaced people, migrants, refugees, or whatever label you want to label them, we are talking about human beings. They are human beings, first and foremost. This is kind of the starting point. I think when my experience as an internally displaced people within Syria, it was very challenging, because when you look globally, a lot of attention is on the, when you look at the media and policy papers, about 65 million people, are internally, are displaced globally. And then the focus moves to refugees, and very little focus on those internally displaced people. I mean, if you look at the Syrian context, for instance, I'm talking about Syria because I am Syrian myself, and I've got some experience with Syria, which I think qualifies me to talk about it. Today, within Syria, you've got over 6.5 million people are internally displaced within Syria, and multiple displacements. I know of someone who've been internally displaced within Syria for over 16 times, moving from one place to another, And if you look at the number, actual registered number of Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries and beyond, it's about 5.3 million, 5.3 or 5.5 million people. So the actual number of internally displaced people within Syria is way much, bigger than the people in the region. Yet if you look at the funding, and the media, and the policy discourse, it's all on the refugee crisis. And of course, you've got arguments for that in terms of, mandates and the groups working with that, and state, sovereignty. But also when you talk about displacement, displacement within internal or external brings with it massive challenges. It starts from leaving your home, the place where you were born, you were raised, where you've got family members, your memories, your school, your friends, your history, your language, your heritage, and you become uprooted, forced to leave that, that place of habitation. So when you cross the international border and you become a refugee, it brings with it also massive challenges. For instance, in the context of displacement within the Middle East, if you look at the neighboring countries who've done a tremendous job, of hosting Syrian refugees. For instance, today Lebanon is hosting over 1 million Syrian refugees, registered. And actual numbers, the people say that about 2 million Syrians today are living in Lebanon. It's about 30 up to 40%, of the population. Turkey is about 4% of their population. Jordan, 10% of their population are Syrian refugees. So when we talk about this context, we're not talking about rights-based, approach. We are talking about hospitality. I remember in my time in Iraq, when I crossed the border, people were telling me, "You're welcome. You're among your brothers and sisters." And again, at the beginning, it was very helpful. It was very encouraging. But as time, crosses, you understand, what does brother and sister mean? What does the word of guest mean? What are my limits for how long I can be a guest? What are my duties and what are my obligations? But by the time I moved to Europe, I was received as an asylum seeker, as a refugee, which means that you've got rights and you've got also obligations. So you've got the limits, that you've got 5 years leave to remain, for instance, in the case of the UK, and you've got rights and duties, which again, it's by rights-based, and which is very helpful. So to answer the second part of the question about how people who are working with migrants or refugees or crossing the border within the country, I mean, we need to recognize that these people are experts by experience. They are the people who moved. These are the people who crossed the borders or within the borders. These are the people who we need to listen and talk to. You can have, policy people and experts. Yet what is missing, and what is really challenging is the insight and kind of, the inputs from these people. So having a conversation is vital and is a first step into helping these people.
Thank you very much. So now listening to this seems to be very complex and difficult. And what you just said, that actually people are moving, right? They're never just at one place at a time. So then how are we able to give them humanitarian aid when they're moving, when they're hard to grasp, when it's not quite clear how many people are actually internally displaced versus the ones that have crossed borders and sometimes are registered at the border. So in formulating this, what is the role of the ICRC here? Why is the Red Cross and the International Committee for the Red Cross engaged with this question?
Let me maybe start in saying that what Ahmad says resonates a lot with our experience, because as a frontline humanitarian responder, which is active first and foremost along violence and war in conflict, our first responders, our first group on which we focus our attentions are those displaced by violence and war. And so in many contexts in which we are, in the largest context, it's active war which displaces, as Ahmad said, very often, several times, people. And I see that most of the people want to stay as close as ever possible to their home, because at the beginning they do entertain the hope that they may go back. And so all our humanitarian response, many of our beneficiaries of our program, first and foremost, are those displaced by violence and war, first and foremost. As second thing which resonates is that, of course, in the policy debate of the international community, there is a lot of energy going into making distinctions between categories. And this is, again, something which we find utterly unuseful as humanitarian organization dealing with people displaced by violence at the front lines, because those people are displaced independently on whether they are internally displaced, refugees, or whatever categories you want to throw at those displacement. So it's of critical importance as a member of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement also that we see the integrity of people displaced. We look at their vulnerabilities, at their needs, and we try to respond wherever they are and whatever status they may have according to different international conventions. So I think it is important that we do recognize this critical importance of responding to vulnerabilities and needs of people at front lines displaced by violence, and not try to make artificial distinctions. As a member of the Red Cross movement, again, then we look at displacement patterns. And of course, some of those displaced cross borders, some of them do not. If they do, we may assist national societies of neighboring countries, of countries of transit, of countries of destination in order to manage some of those migration flows. But I think I just wanted to highlight how much this resonates with our core experience. Also as a first responder in conflict, to look at vulnerabilities and then to see from there on what and how to define a humanitarian response. Everybody knows once people are displaced, they have specific vulnerabilities. Children have not the same, women have not the same as adults, and adults again have different patterns on which we need to support them. Accessing those displaced in many of the contexts in which we are today is a big challenge, because one of the big issues that has characterized the Syrian, the Iraqi, some of the Middle Eastern conflicts today is that we need to have access in order to be able to define a program and to help. Access insecurity to those who are displaced is of critical importance, but here again, I think we have made quite important ways and headways forward in contexts like the Syrian, Iraqi, and other conflicts. I want to highlight another point which Ahmed also critically mentioned. I think everybody knows that at the beginning you can respond to those crises. We know as humanitarian that some basic essentials are necessary to cope with. The problem is protracted long-term displacements, which we are looking at the present moment. It's millions of people displaced over a long time and displaced several times, and where the camp solution or host family solution at the end of the day result in the same. It's a difficulty on coping with big numbers for host communities, for host societies. You like your family for a weekend, but you may not like it for a year in your house. And I think that's what many refugees and IDPs and displaced persons from violent conflict have experienced. And maybe a last consideration, which is of critical importance to us in our approach. We are not just an organization mitigating the effect of displacements on people. We are here to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. So our findings in different studies that we entertain, our findings highlight that the more violations and the more targeted violations that you see on civilians in conflict, the more you have displacements. So the more violence you have on civilians, the more displacements you have, which in other words is the more violations of international humanitarian law you see, the more displacements you get. Therefore, our engagement, of course, with belligerents in order to shrink the needs, to rein them into behavior of respect of international law with regard to the protection of civilians, with regard to conduct of hostilities in the war they are waging, with regard to specific needs of vulnerable populations is of critical importance. So I think we have to recognize we can neither manage nor contain nor adequately respond to the displacement crises that we are confronted today if we just look at it as a humanitarian mitigation strategy. We have to prevent the excesses of violence against people that we are seeing at the present moment in big numbers and over long periods. And if we don't are successful in shrinking the needs and changing behavior, we will not be able to cope with the big disruptions that we have seen over the last couple of years. Everybody knows that this is the largest displacement crisis since the Second World War, that we have difficulties managing those 65 million or more displaced by violence, and one of the difficulties that at the end of the day we haven't been able to shrink the needs and to have completely different behavior by politically responsible circles. So just a brief start to the discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Peter. And just reflecting on this, what you just said about the protective obligations as well as the mitigating obligations that humanitarian actors are bringing to the table. What is actually more important? So what kind of programs do we need? And Ahmad, maybe you can say about this a little bit more. What actions or what programs do you think should be emphasized by humanitarian actors, like concrete strategic plans on how to actually provide protection and safety?
I think the Syrian conflict presents one of the examples of how humanitarians, sometimes try to do things, but they are not able. So it's very important to recognize sometimes, even if you have got the most advanced technologies and the most, capable and capacities, you've got to face the reality sometimes, because sometimes you get caught in a conflict, like the Syrian conflict, with been, massive violations of the international humanitarian law. And sometimes even delivering, some of the basic things like food from point A to point B becomes one of the biggest challenges, where a lot of people would take this as an easy thing, to do like this. But it's becoming really challenges, because today when we talk about the war and the conflict, the nature of the conflicts are changing. The wars are becoming new wars. There are new conflicts. If you see the conflicts, for instance, the Syrian conflict, it's become like, funnily enough, I was reading one of the articles recently, and they did mention that the Syrian conflict is one of the most documented conflicts in the in the whole human history. If you see the amount of footage and the videos coming out of that conflict, you literally see, the conflict or the killing live stream today in Syria. So you've got the technologies coming in, So I think in terms of responding, we need innovative approaches, to respond. Sometimes the classical approaches, might be helpful, but with the current challenges, of the nature of the conflict, I think we need to get creative. And again, I'm not being cynical in terms of being creative, sometimes. But innovation is really needed because of the nature of this conflict. And I think because I am not a technical person, I think this is beyond my capacity to answer this question. But I think innovation, and kind of being more critical and getting out or thinking out of the box is today very, very vital. And just to put you in the kind of, to give you the example of the so-called refugee crisis in Europe. In 2015, Europe was faced with what a lot of people say unprecedented influx of refugees, to Europe. And the way, and again, I'm now trying to be critical of the big players, in the field, was labeled by a lot of people as inadequate. And we've seen kind of a new alliance, a new group of grassroots, kind of standing up, to respond, because they sensed that there'd been somehow lack of response from some of the big players in the field. So I think sometimes being critical is vital, is important, and being reflective, kind of reflecting is also vital, and acknowledging that it's a crisis and it's on a massive scale. Recognizing this could lead, to a potential solution.
I think one of the interesting things that Ahmad is highlighting is not only the nature of conflict and violence is changing, but also the nature of needs of people displaced by violence and conflict is changing. And I would observe with regard to our program that one of the challenges is, of course, when you have big numbers to deal with, your tendency is to respond with standard operation procedures. And standard operation procedures is basic needs. It's medical, food, sanitation, shelter. But that's not really, when you listen to needs of those displaced by violence and conflict, what those displaced by violence and conflict want. Because needs are evolving. You may have educational needs, protective needs may be more important than assistance needs. So I think one of the big challenges with which we are confronted is that we still have the reflex to think that we know what needs are, while needs are evolving with the dynamics of conflict and need adaptation. It still reminds me, whenever I am in some theaters of conflict and trying to listen to what people want, they normally tell you, yeah, it's fine what you bring us. Of course, we need water, medicine, and all that stuff. But we really need something else. We need maybe the school to work again. We need maybe jobs. We need maybe security. All stuff that traditional humanitarian actors are neither used to provide, nor maybe can even provide in certain circumstances. So I would echo the call for innovation and try to shift it also. The first and foremost important innovation is to have a different way on trying to read and to interact with displaced communities. And if you do it seriously, you will end up with a different type of humanitarian program. Most of the time, people are much more interested in being protected than assisted. And when assisted, they have other and different needs than those we are easily available to cover. And I think this is what, at the present moment, is one of the critical issues. A lot of people miss their family members. They want to know who is in prison, who has died. It's for them more important than eventually to have this or that humanitarian assistance program working. And I think that's the big challenge with which we are confronted.
If I just add to your point, which you rightly pointed out, I think when we talk about displacement within the Syrian context or outside of the Syrian context, we are talking about human beings. And in the Syrian context, soon, in a couple of years, it will be 1 decade since the conflict started. For me, it feels like yesterday. I was 20 years when it started. Now I'm almost 20, well, I'm 27. 7 years of my life just passed like that. So for me, when we talk about challenges and needs, when people move, they will have kind of, immediate needs of food and shelter, something, to survive. People are in the survival mood. But when you talk about human being, it's just the human nature that you do not only want to survive. You as a human, it's an instinct. You need to thrive. You as a teacher, as a doctor, as a medical student, as an engineer being displaced by that conflict, you cannot, kind of spend your whole life living in a refugee camp or as an asylum seeker. People need to seek, they're seeking opportunities. They want to thrive. They want to flourish, and this relates to, kind of this idea of changing needs. So, because I remember by the time I left Aleppo, left my town, my only needs were, food and water and a tent. After a few months, I've got food and water and a tent. Now I need, kind of to get my certificate, my university certificate, because I want to pursue my education. After that, I got that, and the needs keep changing. I'm now working I started working on employment and other aspects. So each phase of displacement will have its own needs. That's why, when we talk about humanitarianism, in terms of first responders or emergency, it's very important to have this coordination between, kind of humanitarian and developmental, because you're talking about, kind of a protracted conflict or a protracted displacement situation that if it's not responded or kind of dealt with properly, might end up in another disaster for the host community and the refugee communities.
Maybe one element I wanted to add also from some of the experiences in Syria, beyond Syria as well, when I look at some of the challenges with which we are confronted, is that while displacement at first sight looks very similar from one place to another and from one person to another, there are always very complex and different reasons behind. And we are still insufficiently tuned to understanding different dynamics which happen in the same space but are different in origin. At the present moment, for instance, we see a lot of people displaced by violence in eastern Ghouta or on the northern front in Syria. But at the same time, we see returns to some of the parts of Syria which are more quiet. We have seen 5 million displaced in Iraq, but we still see 2.5 million going back to their villages. So it looks as if the problems were the same, but the needs are very different from one context to another. And I think one of the critical challenges for humanitarians is to read in a very sophisticated way what the reasons behind something which phenomenologically looks the same really are. And I think it needs very different ways of responding. You have people fleeing from cities, and you have people fleeing into cities at the same time. You have urban warfare displacing people, and you have people looking for shelter in cities because cities normally have better infrastructure. And all these things happen in a very small contained space at the same time. I still remember a couple of months ago when I entered Taiz in Yemen, I was struck to see people displaced from the city at the margins of the city and people displaced in the city because of the fighting outside. And so the humanitarian response has to take into consideration the complexity of realities in which we are, and that's one of the reasons more, to be tuned to what effectively the concrete situation and each and every individuals are, and not to just think that we can throw either concept or solutions to specific situations.
Thank you very much. So it's very interesting for me to listen to you, and I think what emerges very clearly, there's a lot of complexity and there's a lot of movement and mobility going on, and it's difficult if we want to take snapshot assessments at one point of movement without seeing the larger picture of evolving needs and how people move. And I think at this point, I actually would like to ask the question, in what actually makes the difference? Why do some people cross borders to leave, and why do some people stay within their home country or the country of origin? What is the key drivers in your experience or personal assessment?
Let me begin answering your question by stating some numbers and figures. And I must say that I hate numbers and figures, because whenever you look at displacement and migration, you've got these pie charts and columns and numbers and figures. But sometimes, they're very, very important. Facts are very important. In the Syrian context today, we are talking about a country that prior to the conflict, the population was about 22 million people lived there. According to the recent figures, I think these were also in 2016, over 500,000 people have lost their lives. Talking about over 2 million people, have got direct collateral damage. You're talking about 6.5 million people are internally displaced within Syria, and over 5 million people are, registered as refugees. Almost, you're talking about half of the population today are living outside of their homes. About 50% of the Syrian population today are living under the poverty line. Syria, prior to the conflict, was a middle-income country. We had one of the best, health indicators in the whole region. Very good education system. A middle-income country that produced labor market and to the region. So. In terms of dynamics of why some people choose to leave and some people choose to stay, I must say, or I should state from the beginning, that the majority, if not all of Syrians prior to 2011, these people did not want to leave their homes. If it was the case with Syrians, we would have them in the 80s and the 90s coming to Europe, but it was not the case. People were living, were near to their home, where they spoke the language, they knew the culture, they understood the dynamics of that place. Why would someone who was born in Aleppo or in Damascus or in Afrin or in Al-Ghouta would leave his family, his friend, his education, his loved ones, and would put his life in danger, and cross the border or the seas to come to Europe, to Sweden or Germany? He or she has got no idea about the language, the culture. We need to understand that this is forced migration. These people have got no say about it. If you see the scale of the destruction of that conflict, and the violation, it's unspeakable horror. And I think in terms of why you have some people stay within the country where others are leaving, I think they've got many factors. For instance, if you look at the case of Homs, the city of Homs, there are parts of the city of Homs totally flattened. Nothing left. Eastern Aleppo, or in places like Al-Ghouta, there's nothing left. If you see the pictures, literally no infrastructure whatsoever. So when some people say, go back to your home, where is home? Home does not exist. And also when you look at the kind of, in terms of internally displacement, it's very challenging. It's very difficult because if you look at the way that the neighboring countries, kind of reacted to displacement or Syrian displacement, in 2011 and 12, the borders were opened. The neighboring country, they kind of adopted, an open door policy. Syrians were welcomed, and kind of they were received. But as of 2014 and the rise of the radical Islamists like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, some of these countries started closing the borders, and in the end of 2015 and 16, there was totally shutting the borders, So for these people who kind of wanted to move, there was no way, for them to leave. And even if you leave, for instance, to Lebanon, over 50% of Syrians today, they do not have a work permit. They're living under appalling situations. If you look at the case of Jordan, for instance, a country, they've got a lot of, not political, economic and social issues, and suddenly having over 600,000 Syrians living there, it brings with it lots of challenges. So I know some people who fled the bombing and the shelling and made it to Jordan or Turkey, and they voluntarily decided to go back to Syria because of the humiliation, because of the difficulties, because of the challenges. And again, you need to understand the host community, they are afraid. There's a lot of concerns. You've got, massive populations fighting over very limited, resources.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Sorry.
I'm actually always surprised when I look at the context in which we operate, why people stay. I'm almost more surprised why they stay than why they leave. Because what is surprising is that despite the abominable circumstances, so many stay. My conclusion in the interaction in many of the field is that people have a preference basically to stay. Then you can make their life miserable as they stay, and you can try to influence where they go through politics, through legal obstacles, through a lot of things. But I'm more surprised at the present moment how many Syrian, Yemeni, Iraqi, Afghani stay close to the places in which they are. And what keeps them close is actually hope. It's still hope that in a foreseeable future they can go back. When hope dies, then people start to go further and to look for a situation in which they can have hope again. So it's less the sort of formalities of assistance and response systems which really move people around. It's at the end of the day, as long as there is hope that they can soon go back, that's what keeps people close to home. When they lose hope, they start to look further where you see better situations. And I think we shouldn't underestimate today, in today's communicative environment, how sophisticated the pondering is that each and every individual family is doing when making heavy decisions for himself and for the family to stay or to go. These are awful decisions because normally these decisions are not nice neither on the one side or the other side. But they are highly informed and highly sophisticated in the pondering of interests. It's pure survival also. Do I get better chances to survive staying or leaving? That's most of the time a discussion which contains many factors in the pondering of each and every family and each and every person that is deciding.
Thank you very much. So I think this is a good time to actually ask whether there are some questions, and I'm quite sure there are some questions of our audience for our panelists. So I would think I go and take 1 or 2 or 3 questions, and I would of course prefer if our great students make the start in asking questions. And I think we have to keep it a little bit dense, so I would ask you to just state your name and state your questions. We have to finish at 7:30 sharp. So in the interest of giving our panelists time to answer the questions, please be brief in asking your questions as well. Okay, young lady up there.
First of all, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. My name is Hao Yim. I'm a second-year master candidate at the Graduate Institute, and I'm also a program coordinator of a Chinese student-led initiative with the mandate to provide educational assistance for Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Turkey. So my question is for Ahmad. So with the first-hand research knowledge with the refugees, what would you think would be the best starting point to addressing the gap in terms of the educational resources? Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Let's get some more questions. This lady up there, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Héloïse Riodel. I'm an independent researcher, consultant. I'm about to release a publication I did on mixed migration for the START network, looking at, also humanitarian perspective. So I would like to address maybe my question to Peter. If I look at the policy setting, I really see two trends. I see there's a strong focus on containment. We talked about closed borders. I mean, in the context of the famous European crisis, was very clear. There's everything but out of Europe. And the parallel to that I observe is that there is a focus on integration, access to job. We can look at the compact that's very much about that, the increasing role of development actors in parallel to humanitarian actors. So now when we focus on the humanitarian perspective, and this is where I would like the feedback, for me, really what's needed, and this was mentioned, is the respect for IHL, less violation that cause displacement, and what is happening to that, what is happening to accountability. The red lines have been crossed in Syria and elsewhere, and nothing really is happening to belligerents. And the second aspect, which is related to that,
just the interest.
I'm finished.
Okay, thank you.
Is the respect for the right to move, whether we look at moving internally, but also the right to seek asylum. This is at stake as well if people are closing border. Mm-hmm. So those two are linked. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, I was long.
One last question. Yes, the lovely lady there.
Hi, my name is Helena Hahn. I'm a master's student at the Graduate Institute, and my question is rather general. I'm wondering about the assistance that returnees, I guess specifically in Syria, can expect nowadays, and also to what extent it is a huge challenge given that political control is still quite differentiated depending on the various regions that you travel to.
Thank you. These are some very interesting questions. Ahmad, do you want to start out? And then I give back to Peter. Okay. Yes.
Sure.
I think
sorry.
Yes.
I just forgot for some reason.
Yeah,
Sorry
exactly.
about that. To answer your question about, the educational gap, I think this is one of the biggest challenges that is facing the Syrian children at the moment. And I think that the future of these children is on a stake. Because if you look at the situation, for instance, in Turkey in 2018, well, at the end of 2019, they will shut their doors. There will be no education in Arabic. It's going to be, they're trying to integrate Syrian refugees or Syrian children refugees into the Turkish education system. And this presents a massive challenge, to the families as well as their children. So I was reading a report recently that mentioned over 300,000 children were born in Turkey, for instance, since 2011, and we still don't know for how long these people will be living in Turkey. So this is obviously an identity crisis. There's a gap between what these people are used to back in Syria, and what the new curriculum or the new kind of system in Turkey. If you look, I remember my time in Iraq, for instance, even, for instance, in the case of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. So there was kind of a conflict, really, between which curriculum to use for Syrian refugees. So between the Iraqi government that wanted the Iraqi curriculum, or the Kurdish, autonomous region wanted its own curriculum, or the Syrian opposition based in Baghdad, in Istanbul. So it was all political. And if you look at the case, of Lebanon, it is one of the biggest challenges there. Over 75% of Syrians today, Syrian children, are out of education. You're talking about a lost generation, and we're risking, that we're going to have a very bleak future. So I think what is now being suggested today is kind of have a global curriculum to address the needs of these displaced people, that you will receive it no matter if regardless of your nationality or where you are displaced.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Peter.
I do agree that one of the big issues that we are confronted is the containment, integration, polarity, which characterizes most of the policies of state. I don't know what you feel in here in that room, but if I look back at 30 years of diplomatic and other career that I have done, it's one of those areas where evidence and policies see the biggest gap. Everybody knows that in terms of scientific evidence, integration is the only thing that works. Everybody knows that in terms of policy, this is difficult to have consensual agreement in our societies first and foremost. So it leaves us with these uncomfortable mixes where governments cannot really define policies according to evidence, but are defining policies according to resentments in society, which often inform containment recipes, which are by and large unsuccessful, but nevertheless used. So I think one of the issues is really to engage with governments on this gap and to try to help close the gap and to demonstrate that in terms of evidence, the integration path, the earlier, the faster, the better integration works, the less problems migration policies will be confronted with. And I would add one point more, and I can only agree with your hypothesis that the more you give a say in people themselves to look for the best way forward that they need as they are exposed to difficulties and pressures and violence and displacements, the more you have a chance that your policies are functioning at the end. The more you try to decide for people, the less those policies will work because people decide themselves what is best for themselves. And finally, let me say something on assistance for returnees. I mean, it's a big and hot political potato at the present moment because a lot of countries have basically maneuvered themselves into the dichotomy of reconstruction aid only if there is regime change. And I think we have to maintain that return and rehabilitation and support for people returning must be possible, even if there is no regime change and even if there is no change in the political system. That's the very essence of humanitarian assistance. If we tie aid to return and basic rehabilitation of services to the transformation of the system, most likely nobody will return, and most likely you will have a recipe for more displacement and faster displacement. So one of the critical issues is at the present moment to find this soft spot in between those who tie all assistance to displaced persons within Syria and all assistance to Syrians within Syria to the transformation of the political system. And to find a compromise which allows us to do rehabilitation and stabilization of people, helping them to return to their homes and helping them with basic infrastructure. Otherwise, if this will not happen, and if the dogmatism of we can only help them if the regime changes, if this dogmatism prevails, you will just get double of displacement.
Can I
Very
add
briefly,
something?
exactly.
Yeah, very
Yep.
briefly.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to, I think for me, the right to return is a right which must be respected. People who left their homes should have the right to return, no matter, after how long. Secondly, I think it's important to also note that, dignified and voluntary, return is important. You cannot push people back, to Syria, where they've got no place in some incidents. We've got no way of kind of surviving there. So I think just to answer, this question, I mean, the prospect is very difficult. Current, taking into consideration the current political polarization that happened in the country. So we need to understand that there is a legitimacy crisis somehow among some Syrians, so that even if they go back to Syria, they do see that the state is not legitimate. As a consequence, the violence, or the legitimate violence, as the government says, cannot be justified. So, which leads me to my final point about the social contract that we as Syrians need today. It's going to be kind of a next to impossible mission to come up with a social contract to unite and bring back all these ethnic, religious, sectarian, whatever groups together after 7 years of bloody conflict. But I'm sure with the support of our neighbors and friends and the international community, we will be able to do it.
Thank you very much. And just to kind of, we've heard a lot of information, a lot of points. I think there's a lot we have to digest a little bit for some time. But to not send you off without some sort of conclusion, I would like actually Peter to give us some final idea of, after listening to everything, so what should we take away from our today's discussion? What are the key points, or the key point for you?
Well, the key point for me remains that while we see transformations of conflicts, while we see transformations of needs, an integrated approach to displacement is of essence, and we have to look at people as a whole, at those who are displaced as a whole, and not in a fragmented way. And the real humanitarian approach is to look at their vulnerabilities and to try to stabilize wherever we can those vulnerabilities. And I think Ahmad, in his introduction, has highlighted how important it is to put the person at the center of our reflection, and not to artificially preconceive what solutions are, while there are only solutions if you try to put people as the measurement of your policies and not the other way around.
Thank you very much. So we would also like to thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists for giving us this very insightful talk, but also thank you for the audience for the great questions, and thank you for attending today's event. I wish you a pleasant Monday evening.
Thank you very much.